Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining me. It is Becky Droz, and you are listening to Gorilla HR, the podcast. Today, we are talking about culture in the workplace, and we are continuing our conversation on how employers can use total rewards to make sure that they are really living up to be the kind of employer that they want to be. So, when we think about culture in our workplaces, that is really our whole brand. It's really our identity, our personality, what people think of when they think about working there. So, what we're going to talk about today is really focused around compensation in regards to that culture. So, one of the things that I want you to think about is in your workplace, when people are thinking about pay, are they like, yay, I'm paid so great to work here. Yay, my money that I get paid every 2 weeks is enough for me to cover my life. I can do all the things that I want to do. I can pay for my medical bills. I can go on vacation. I can save for retirement. All those things that I need money for are A plus. Everything is happening. You might be the opposite though. You might be like, yeah, my people are getting paid, but I don't really know if they're making ends meet. They may still be living paycheck to paycheck. And you may have everything in between those options as well. When we think about culture and we think about pay, we can't just jump right to we want to be a top payer. We want to be leading the market and paying people even more than they're worth because that may not be something that supports your organization overall. Anytime we're talking about total rewards, and especially when we're talking about people's pay, we really need to back up and think about your organization and what your organization is all about. So if your company is about offering some sort of really unique product, or you have something where there's really specialized skills, maybe it's something really technical, when you think about that, think about how that's going to drive pay. You might have to pay more to get those skills. But if you're an organization where you have a lot of turnover, you're really about just like quick results, do something, get it out the door. Maybe it's warehousing, maybe it's something where it doesn't have some of that real specialty involved, then your philosophy might be a little bit different because it might be more about like, we know that we're going to move people in and out faster. There's a lot more turnover. And so the comp may not justify being as high as some of these other roles. So really think about your organization before jumping to, well, how do we want to pay people? I will say that there is a little bit of an exception to that if we think about living wage and making sure that people are making enough that based on where they live, in addition to what we're seeing as far as cost of labor and what people are actually making for those jobs, that's a situation where you might be thinking about your philosophy from a little bit of a different aspect. So certainly living wage is something that can have an impact on how you decide to pay as well. Either way, when we think about pay and we think about what we're doing, there are several things that we need to do. So, if we think about the kind of organization that we have, who we want to be, what we want our identity to be like when it comes to pay, we need to think about our market position. So, this at the highest level, when I talk to organizations and I'm like, hey, well, what's your comp philosophy? People often look at me like I have a third eyeball in the middle of my head and they're like, well, what do you mean? We pay people. Like, that's what we do. They do a job and then they get a paycheck, and that's the philosophy. Well, if that's your philosophy, that's fine. You can certainly have that. And for many people, that is kind of where they are in that whole philosophy development discussion. But really, I would encourage you to think a little bit deeper and really think about your market position when you think about your comp philosophy. So, thinking about your organization, one, you might need to lag the market. That means you're going to be a little bit behind what we see other organizations pay for the same type of job, the same type of skill set, the same type of work environment. You might say, I just don't have the funds to be able to pay as much, so I'm going to be behind a little bit. Often we see organizations that need to lag a little bit if they're newer. They may just not have the money yet. Maybe they've invested into capital to start the business. Maybe there's different equipment. They don't have profits yet. Whatever it is, they may have a situation where they know they can't necessarily pay as much. And so they are making a decision that says, we're going to be a little bit behind. Now, they might do some other things and they might do some other types of variable pay, something that down the road is going to have some good reward. But up front, when we think about just that base pay, there are reasons and there are times where you may truly say, I need to be a little bit behind. That's okay, as long as it's intentional and you know what you're going to do about it. Most organizations say that they want to match the market. So that means that they are in a position where they say, we want to pay enough to be competitive, that we can get the people that we need and that we can keep them, but we don't want to be overpaying. For a lot of organizations, this is where they want to be. They just say, we want to do what we need to do. We got to meet the basics, but we're not, doing anything super fancy, but we don't want to be behind either. That's okay too. Then we have organizations that want to lead. They say, we know we want to be ahead. That, again, often where we have those tech people, and if they leave, the skill sets are really going to be missed. It's really going to have a huge impact on the organization. Often that's where we see those organizations that say, when I think about my market position, I want to be leading. I want to be paying a little bit more than what the market is actually going for. Then, of course, we have all those organizations that say, I don't have a philosophy. Again, these are my people that are like, I don't know, people show up and they get a paycheck and that's kind of where it ends. So, not uncommon either. But again, I encourage you, think about your organization. Who do you want to be known as? What do you want your culture and your brand to be like when you think about pay? I know that when I was working for other organizations, I certainly didn't want to be working somewhere where all I thought was like, I do something, I get some paycheck, and that's that. I really wanted to know, like, hey, I am valued for my work. I know what my worth is as an employee, and I'm going to be paid for it. So, really put some thought into what that philosophy is. There are a couple different things to do once you've determined what is that philosophy, what are you going to pay. The next thing to do is actually validate. Are you doing what you've set out to do? I can't tell you how many organizations I come across and they say, oh, yeah, we are competitive. We match the market. That's where we want to be. And I say, great. Well, where are you getting data to figure out if you are actually matching the market? And they're like, well, what do you mean? I just know what we pay. Well, if you don't know what the job is actually worth, you don't know what the cost of labor is for that job, then how do you know that you're even doing what you set out to do? So that's where we need to do some job evaluation and figure out what our positions and worth. I'm a huge proponent of using market data. I like to look at external data, see what's actually going on, and then use that to determine, are we doing what we set out to do? So there's a ton of data out there. The trouble is, some of it is crap. Sometimes you get what you pay for, and some free data is not worth anything. That doesn't mean all free data is bad. There are certainly some good sources. So, one place you might start if you're trying to figure out what's going on in the market is onetonline.org. That is a government site that is pulling from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Great place, good, statistically sound, valid data where you can pop in your jobs, you can look at your different locations and see what is the going rate? What are other people getting paid for that job? Great place to start. If you don't have anything else, you might look at some of that free crowdsourced data. I just say be cautious with it. Don't rely too heavily if you're looking at some of that crowdsourced data because you don't necessarily know if it's validated against the job expectations, the job duties. And so it may not necessarily be apples to apples. You might be looking at comp data that doesn't really match the job that you're looking at. I love to talk about my husband when I talk about looking at that market data and making sure that you have data that is matching what you're actually expecting someone to do. So, my hubby, he works for a big bank and he has a vice president title. And so, if I were to look at data and look at a vice president for a bank, I would be seriously disappointed when I look at what my husband brings home. When I look at my husband's job, I need to make sure that I'm not looking at a VP of a big bank. I really need to look at what he's expected to do. He's not running a team. He doesn't have a lot of direct reports that are reporting up to him. He's really a data nerd. So I would need to be looking at somebody who's doing statistical analysis and doing some forecasting and some risk analysis. That's the kind of job I would need to look at. So if I look at VP, again, I'm going to think I should have a chef, I should have a masseuse, I should be on vacation every day, but that's simply not the reality because that's not really what he's doing on a day-to-day basis. When you look at that market data, make sure again you're looking at expected duties. What are the skills that somebody has to be able to get into that job and use that to pull that market data. Again, cautious with free data. There are also a lot of sources out there that are really expensive. So it might be cost prohibitive and everything in between. Of course, you've always got consultants out there, people like me, who are happy to pull that data and do that research for you. So look at the market, figure out the job worth from an external standpoint. Once you've got that data, then I would also encourage you to look internally and define the job worth within your organization. What I mean by that is you might have positions where, from a market standpoint, one position is higher or lower, but you might have some real internal value to that. I had a client years ago and they had a position that was kind of a director of administration. They had HR, they had accounting and finance, they had IT. So they had all the different support services and the shared services within the organization. And from a comp standpoint, that rated a little bit lower than some of the other technical folks. However, even though the comp data, the market data said, well, that admin role is a little bit lower than somebody with some technical skills, the organization said, but that's really my number two person. That is the person who I truly value. If I'm not here, they're the one who's going to step in for me. They're the one who's going to make decisions. They can speak on my behalf. They can represent me. And so even though we had that market data, we said, well, we've got some internal value and we don't want to discredit that either. So we needed to look at that position in comparison to others within the organization and say, hey, we value this one a little bit more. Lots of considerations there when you're looking at that data. So I don't want you to say, okay, if I've looked at this external data, I just ignore all other factors, because that's not true. You know your people, you know your jobs. And so it's using all these different pieces together. I always think about comp as really being both an art and a science. I say we got to start with the data, that statistically sound valid data, and then figure out how do we apply it within your organization so that it makes sense for your specific organization. Everybody doesn't need the same things. All right, so we've thought about our market position. Now, where do we want to be paying? What do we want our identity to be? We're looking externally to data to figure out, are we actually doing what we've said we want to do? Once we've done that, we really have to think about who we are as an organization and how we're going to maintain that. Comp work is not something that you can just do one time and put it on a shelf and you're done with it. It is like a plant that you have to nurture, you have to water, you have to give it sunlight. And when we do that, what we're really thinking about are what are the changes that we're seeing when we think about the cost of labor and also the cost of living. A lot of organizations get those confused and they use them interchangeably, but certainly cost of labor and cost of living are not the same thing. So I want you all to use the appropriate language when you're talking about jobs and you're thinking about what you have to pay people. When you're thinking about what kind of increases you're going to give, are you going to give a merit increase or an across the board general wage increase? What you're really talking about there is cost of labor. What does it take to hire and retain somebody into that job? When we look at the trends historically, we would say that the increase or the change in the cost of labor year over year was going to be around 3%. For so many years, if you asked me, hey, what are we going to see? What are people doing? It was going to be about 3%. Well, over the last several years, that change in cost of labor has gone up. We saw that increase and get closer to 4%. And as I look at 2025, the projections are a little bit closer to 4% as well. I've seen everything from 3.7 to 4.1. So I would really anticipate looking at around 4%. Now, some people do want to look at the cost of living and they want to see how that has changed. Well, from a historical standpoint, the cost of living really came about when we look at Social Security, and Social Security was put into place to make sure that people who are retired, people who are older and no longer working, had money to sustain their life. So we want to make sure that the people who are no longer working, who are collecting that Social Security, that money is not being eroded by inflation. So that's where we have Social Security and cost of living increases. When we look at 2025, we're seeing 2.5% is what we're going to see as far as increase. Last year it was 3.2%. In 2023, we had a much bigger percent. We actually had 8.7, which was the largest that we'd seen since the 80s. So definitely some changes there. Now, as an organization, you might give a cost of living increase or a COLA. Now, I would always say that a COLA was a four-letter word. It used to drive me nuts when employers were like, well, we're just going to give everybody the same thing. And I would say, well, are all your people giving you the same thing as far as their contribution as an employee? Typically, the answer is no. But as we've seen some changes and we have seen some greater inflation, now I've backed off on my hard stance against COLA and I've said, well, let's look at doing a combination. As an employer, you might say, because I do want to be competitive and I want to have a culture that is certainly aware of changes in what things cost, I'm going to give some kind of base increase that's based on cost of living, whether or not you follow the true amount set up by Social Security. But then you also have the cost of labor. So we might have some differentiation based on what we're seeing in trends overall. Now, what that also means is that you might have to do market adjustments because not all positions change at the same rate. If all positions constantly moved at the same rate, then you could give everybody the same thing and you'd always maintain whatever that position was, whatever that competitive stance was from your philosophy. But keep in mind, you might have positions that have different skill sets that develop or they move up faster, or from simple supply and demand, you might not have enough people going into certain jobs. And so you have to pay a little bit more in order to keep up with the market. We also have positions where the rate at which we see those increases is a little bit faster in some than others. When you're thinking about those increases and how much you need to give people, think about the amount of time that it takes to become proficient in a certain job. You don't gain proficiency at the exact same pace. So if you're working in an admin support role, the rate at which you become an expert at that job might be a lot quicker than the rate that you become an expert in an IT job or an engineering job. Some of those technical positions, some of those professional positions, it's going to take a lot longer to get really proficient and become an expert in those different roles. So, what you might see is that you might have somebody who gets to that level of proficiency faster. So, they're going to get their bumps and their increases because now they're fully performing. They might get there faster. You might have somebody where it takes a little bit longer. So, you just have to be aware of what's happening with the cost of labor and all those different positions to make sure that per job, you are looking at the market, comparing that to your philosophy, and making sure that you get people at the right place. When we think about pay, it's not just base pay either. Variable pay is something that a lot of organizations use because they say, well, I want to see results. I want to pay for specific measurable indicators that show me that we are successful as an organization. It's not always about profit. It might be sales, it might be customer service scores, it might be a net promoter score. You can pick lots of different things and use variable pay to drive the behaviors that you want. So think about variable pay as a tool that you can use that says, what are the behaviors that I want to see from my people and how am I going to incent them to do it? One of the things you really need to start with when we're considering variable pay is what problem are you solving? If you just say, hey, I'm going to throw money at something without really stopping and stepping back to say, what am I setting out to do? You're going to create a bigger issue for yourself. So you need to think about what's the goal here? What are my people going to respond to? And is this the right reward for that? We've seen organizations that use variable pay and it backfires. So this is also one where you really need to poke holes in your plan. When you're using variable pay, we really have to be careful that we're not doing something that's incenting the wrong behavior. Make sure that you really say, what is somebody going to do? Are they doing the right things? Maybe it's making a sale to somebody, but maybe you're making a sale to somebody who doesn't actually have the money to pay for it when the bill comes in. So you might be saying, I've got this sale. I want you to go ahead and now I get my reward. But if that client hasn't actually paid yet and you've paid that incentive out to the person, and then the dollars don't come in from the client, well, now you've got a problem because you've already paid something out, but you didn't have the money. You've really got to think about variable pay from the context of how long does it take to get that desired behavior? When do you have the result to make sure that you're setting yourself up from success as far as having something that makes sense to get the behavior, but also something that's sustainable. You don't want to put a plan into place and it's something that ultimately you can't afford to do it. That applies whether we're talking about base pay or some kind of variable pay. When we think about variable pay, some of the things that we've seen that are more common are hiring bonuses, particularly as we came out of COVID and a lot of employers were really struggling to get people in the door. We saw a lot of organizations that were offering sign on bonuses. Well, that can be good as far as getting people in the door, but again, poke holes in it. Are you getting the right people in the door? Are they going to actually stay once you get them there? We see a lot of bonuses for people who achieve certain measures. Maybe they really hit something out of the park. You might do a spot award for that. It might be something where it's not necessarily so defined or something that's long term, but somebody has something that is really immediate that has had a really positive impact on the organization. You might do some kind of immediate spot award for those folks. Variable pay is something that there's a lot of flexibility. You can base it off of company performance. It could be based off of a team, even an individual. So lots of flexibility there. Again, poke holes in your plan. What are you trying to solve for? Is it enough to get the behavior you want? And how can the system be manipulated? Because certainly I know, I hate to say it, but there are some folks who might try to take advantage. When we have the conversation about pay and culture, we also need to talk a little bit about pay equity. We are in a time where we are seeing much more pay transparency from a regulatory standpoint, but also because people are talking about it and we can't stop them from talking about it. Years ago, we would see handbooks and language that said you can't talk about your pay or you can't disclose it. Well, that has been protected concerted activity from the National Labor Relations Board for a really long time. So even the organization had rules about it, it's been illegal to block that. So people can talk about pay. You can't stop them from doing that. And people are doing it. I think there's been just an overall cultural change where people are much more willing to talk about pay versus keep things secret. So people now are so open. Of course, everybody now is putting their whole life on Facebook and TikTok and everywhere else anyway. So it's the same thing when we go to pay. Now, I don't necessarily actually think that's bad. I think there's some value in doing that. But as an employer, you just need to know it's happening. People are talking about it. So if you think that you're keeping that all in and it's all super top secret, hush, hush, you're probably wrong. And so you need to think about if people have access to that information or they're sharing that pay information with each other, what is that going to do to your culture? If you bring somebody in, you hire them, and let's say you are using some salary history to make your decision, which in some places you got to be cautious about that. There are some salary history bands out there. But let's say you bring somebody in and you know that they were making 40,000 before. And so you say, well, I'm going to just pay them 45. I know that that's an increase. However, you looked at that job, your HR team looked at that job, you looked at the cost of labor, you did that market assessment, and you know that the going rate based on your philosophy is, let's say, 50 to 70. And you've decided, well, because I know what that person was making, I'm paying 45. Well, they start talking to the other person who was recently hired and find out that they're at 50. Well, how are they going to feel? They're going to be pissed, just like you would be. So keep in mind that even if your organization is not sharing, people are talking about it. And what is that going to do to culture? Now, I would love to see more organization push towards greater pay transparency, simply because people are looking for it, but also because that's really going to help us move the needle on pay equity. We can go a lot deeper into pay equity in another session, but keep in mind that by talking about pay and having greater transparency, that is showing us that we are actually moving the needle on pay equity. So be proud of what you've done. Do the work up front to figure out what you're going to pay somebody and then stick to that. And if you've done your work and you have a philosophy, not that people aren't going to say they still want more money, but they're going to feel that their pay is determined fairly and they're going to feel good about it. That's going to increase engagement, which is going to be a win-win all around. So there's a lot around the pay history piece. Again, if you are making decisions and you're looking, well, what was somebody making before? You need to make sure that that's not going in the face of what you've set out to do. We also want to continue to work towards greater pay transparency. Of course, it has to make sense for your organization. I'm not suggesting every organization just immediately throw it out there. Although we are seeing more and more states where there is pay transparency required. We are seeing more states where people have to put the actual starting range or the hiring range when they do job postings, which I think is great. Honestly, I think if you're an organization who has figured out what your philosophy is and what you're going to pay, put the posting out there with the pay range. And it doesn't have to be the full range, but at a starting salary. And it can be a range. It doesn't have to be a flat number, but realistically, and think about the time that you're going to save for your hiring managers. Instead of having people sitting on the phone and talking about, well, what are you looking for this job? Well, I'm looking for 60 to 70. And you know that you're only paying 40 to 50. It's a mismatch and you're wasting everybody's time. I say skip all of that, use some transparency, be smart about it, do what makes sense for your organization. But certainly when you think about culture and you think about pay, you need to be considering what's your stance on pay transparency. That also means you need to have some thoughts about pay equity, not just the legal parts. Certainly we have that as a requirement. I don't want to go down the path of what's required, but think about what the right thing to do is. In my opinion, paying people fairly and looking and doing the analysis to make sure that you are actually being equitable is what's important. So not just about the law, but about what's the right thing when it comes to people. A lot of organizations are focused a little bit more on pay transparency and pay equity now. Again, not just from the legal aspects, but because their people are asking for it and their people want it. When we think about pay, there are so many different things that we can do. There are a lot of different moving pieces, whether it's base pay, whether it's variable pay, and then how that pans out when people are talking about it. When we look at our culture, think again about who do you want to be, evaluate what you're paying people, and make sure that you're committing to what you've set out to do. All right, so when it comes to pay, make sure you're thinking about who do you want to be, make sure you stick to it. I look forward to chatting with you more on Gorilla HR, the podcast.
That's it for this episode of the Gorilla HR podcast. We hope you found some unconventional wisdom and actionable advice to help you in your own HR journey. Remember, we're all working together to build better workplaces. Want to join in the conversation? Send us your questions, stories, and maybe even your own guerrilla tactics to podcast@gorilla-hr.com. And if you enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, and share with your network. Until next time,